What is up, guys? So for this video, I cannot wait to discuss and analyze the second episode of Season 4 of Better Call Saul entitled Breathe. This was another absolutely amazing episode to say the least, which contained a significant amount of plot development and also culminated with a completely unexpected and shocking ending, which left us with a tremendous amount of suspense and intrigue heading into the next episode. So without further delay, let's jump right into this review of Episode 2. Okay, so the second episode of Season 4 of Better Call Saul started with a cold opening scene of Dr. Barry Goodman, Gus Fring's personal doctor, thoroughly inspecting on the condition of Hector's health in the aftermath of his stroke. This action was then followed by Dr. Barry Goodman reporting his findings back to Gus Fring, to which he stated that while Hector is no longer in a coma, he is still currently unresponsive and there is no way of knowing if or when he will ever be back to his normal self again. This information was of course met with disdain from Gus Fring, who, as we all know from the plot of Breaking Bad, wants to keep Hector alive and lucid in order to physically as well as psychologically torture him in retribution for killing Max. With this being said, in addition to the dark and sadistic nature of Gus Fring's motivations that were displayed in this scene also further reiterated the fact that this all-consuming obsession that Gus Fring has towards enacting his calculated and methodical revenge against Hector is clearly going to be the key driving force of the plot involving Gus and the cartel this season. Following this cold opening scene, the first scene of Act 1 of this episode displayed a scene of Jimmy and Kim at Kim's apartment, which took place in very close proximity to Chuck's funeral. In this scene, we saw a very upbeat and high-spirited Jimmy getting ready for a day of job interviews, seemingly in order to obtain the gainful employment he needs during the 10-month period of time which he's banned from practicing the law. This rather sanguine demeanor that Jimmy displayed in the scene rather perplexed Kim, who appeared somewhat surprised to see Jimmy acting so enthusiastic and optimistic following the immediate aftermath of Chuck's death. However, in spite of Kim's visible feelings of perplexity towards Jimmy's method of coping, she nonetheless remained incredibly supportive of Jimmy during this trying period of time. This plot would of course come into play later in this episode during Kim's meeting with Howard and Rebecca at HHM regarding Chuck's estate. This first scene of Act 1 was then followed by a scene of Nacho and his father Manuel Varga at his father's upholstery shop following the aftermath of Hector's stroke, where we saw Nacho state to his father that he'll no longer have to use his upholstery shop as a front for Hector. Following this statement by Nacho, we then saw Manuel, who was clearly still upset and dejected from this ordeal Nacho made him go through, place the drug money that was given to him by Hector on the counter, which Nacho reluctantly took back when it was made clear that his father wanted absolutely nothing to do with that drug money or the way of life that his son effectively forced onto him. Following Nacho taking back the drug money, Manuel then asked Nacho how much longer Nacho will be involved with the cartel, to which Nacho responded he is working on trying to get out. However, while Nacho may have in fact wanted to leave the cartel and the criminal underworld for good, following this whole ordeal, his plot would of course take a very surprising yet necessary turn at the end of this episode. Following the scene of Nacho and his father, the third scene of Act 1 then displayed what was in my opinion one of the most thought-provoking scenes of this episode of Jimmy arriving to his job interview at Neff Copier's. Following some small talk including some dialogue that related to a Hummel figurine that foreshadowed Jimmy's plot that would ensue at the end of this episode, we then saw Jimmy give a very impressive performance at his job interview, which led to the heads of Neff Copier's offering him a job right there on the spot. However, much to the surprise of the heads of Neff Copier's, Jimmy then became visibly upset following this job offer and began to berate the heads of Neff Copier's with a barrage of insults for buying into his disingenuous sales pitch, which was then followed by Jimmy rejecting their job offer and storming out of their office building. With this being said, this rather enigmatic scene at the end of Act 1 raises the very intriguing and open-ended question of why did Jimmy turn down the job offer in the manner that he did. In my opinion, I think one very possible explanation for what made Jimmy so upset in this scene and reject the job offer in the way that he did was the fact that these men at Neff Copier's reminded him of his father, who he despised for being a very naive man who was often taken advantage of as a result of him buying into his customers' fabricated stories at his store in Cicero. So, taking this possible rationale into consideration, I think that this job interview in this scene is in fact a reminder of the many life experiences that Jimmy had in the past that resulted in him becoming a very angry and resentful individual who will inevitably go down a path which will lead him to dismiss everyone who ever cared about him and eventually become the self-serving Saul Goodman character who we first met in the plot of Breaking Bad. Following the conclusion of Act 1, Act 2 of this episode then opened with a scene of Mike with his granddaughter Kaylee at the park, which was then followed by Mike meeting with Lydia Radar Quayle in the aftermath of his unauthorized security check at Madrigal. During this meeting, we saw that Lydia was rather perplexed by the actions of Mike in the previous episode due to the fact that his job at Madrigal exists only on paper. This was then followed by Lydia asking Mike to stop the further security checks he intended on doing. Following Mike stating that he does not intend to comply with Lydia's request, Lydia then responded with what appeared to be a veiled threat by stating, "At the moment you have Gus Fring's respect, I'd want to keep that if I were you." This conversation would of course come into play in Act 3 of this episode during a phone call that Lydia had with Gus Fring. Following the scene, the second scene of Act 2 then displayed a scene of the cousins, Marco and Leonel Salamanca, watching over Hector in a hospital bed. This was then followed by some dialogue between the hospital staff where it was implied that Gus Fring sent in a generous grant to the hospital where Hector is being treated in order to provide Hector with a doctor from Johns Hopkins whose area of expertise could increase Hector's chances of recovery, which as stated previously is incredibly sadistic considering the fact that Gus only wants Hector's condition to improve so that he can in fact torture him. Following the arrival of this new doctor, she then recommended to the cousins, as well as Arturo and Nacho, who arrived shortly after her, that they speak with Hector even in his unresponsive state in order to stimulate his brain function. Following the new doctor leaving the room, Marco Salamanca then demanded Nacho and Arturo speak with Hector as per the doctor's requests, who then gave the unresponsive Hector a status update on the business dealings of the cartel. So, taking all these plot details into consideration, while the scene was primarily a plot development scene, it also nonetheless foreshadowed the climactic scene that would ensue for both Nacho and Arturo at the end of this episode. Following Act 2, Act 3 of this episode opened with a scene of Gus in front of the Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant receiving a phone call from Lydia, who reported to him on the problem she perceived that Mike is causing at Madrigal. During this scene, we saw Gus, who was clearly preoccupied with his business dealings with the cartel in the aftermath of Hector's stroke, effectively tell Lydia to give in to Mike's demands and then proceeded to terminate their phone call unceremoniously following the arrival of Tyrus to the restaurant. So, taking this phone call as well as Mike's meeting with Lydia into consideration, while it does appear that Mike's actions could in fact go unchecked, at the same time I think it's still clear that Mike is not completely aware of the true nature of his new employer, who he once stated to Lydia in Season 3 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Fall, was just a common drug dealer. So, taking this into consideration, I think that Mike could still likely experience some adversity this season as part of the plot of him learning about the true nature of his new employer. Following this conversation with Lydia, Gus then spoke with Tyrus in his office on the current state of Hector's health, which as a result ended up further foreshadowing the intense final scene that would occur at the end of this episode. Following this scene, the second scene of Act 3 then displayed another very thought-provoking and complex scene of Kim arriving at HHM to meet with Howard and Chuck's ex-wife Rebecca in Howard's office in order to discuss the details of Chuck's estate. In this scene, we learned that Jimmy was effectively cut out of Chuck's will when it was revealed that Chuck only left Jimmy $5,000 of his multi-million-dollar estate, as well as a handwritten letter. Following Rebecca leaving Howard's office, we then saw Kim get rather upset with Howard, who confronted him regarding his decision to come over to her apartment after Chuck's funeral to tell Jimmy his theory that Chuck killed himself, which Kim states was in fact a very selfish act by Howard, who only unloaded his guilt to Jimmy to make himself feel better in the aftermath of Chuck's death, in spite of what this revelation may in fact do to Jimmy. With this being said, I think this outburst by Kim towards Howard certainly stems from her worries surrounding how Jimmy is acting and coping in the aftermath of his brother's death, which she likely blames on Howard's revelation to Jimmy. Furthermore, while Howard does not accept Kim's premise that he told Jimmy what he did only to make himself feel better, I think that Howard being in a visibly better mood in this scene compared to the end of the Season 4 premiere does in fact give some credence to Kim's accusations against Howard. However, at the same time, unbeknownst to Kim, is the fact that Jimmy may in fact be relieved that his brother is dead and was actually affected by Howard's statement in a positive manner, which in my opinion would further complicate this whole issue. So with all this being said, due to the fact that there are clearly an enormous amount of complex emotions that are going through the minds of all of these characters following the aftermath of Chuck's death, I think it's truly impossible to know for certain what Jimmy, Kim, and Howard are in fact thinking, and whether or not they are in fact sincere in their actions. However, that having been said, I think as we move forward in the plot of Season 4, we will in fact likely get a much better understanding of the true emotional state of all of these characters. Following this scene, the fourth and final act of this episode then displayed a scene of Jimmy and Kim at Kim's apartment following the two separate plots these characters had in this episode. With this being said, what we can notice right away about this scene was the fact that both Jimmy and Kim were not completely honest with one another in regards to the true nature of their respective days, whereby Jimmy did not tell Kim the whole story about the nature of his first job interview, and Kim did not tell Jimmy that she attended Chuck's estate meeting or about the letter that Chuck left to him, which was seemingly done by both Jimmy and Kim as a result of them not wanting to hurt each other emotionally. Following this mutual insincerity, this scene nonetheless resulted in a passionate embrace by these two characters, which in my opinion was in fact rather significant in that it might have displayed the last completely blissful moment that these two characters will experience with one another in the plot of Better Call Saul, as a result of all the aforementioned plot details that occurred in this episode that are seemingly setting up their relationship to begin its inevitable deterioration in the coming episodes. Furthermore, at the end of this scene, we then saw Jimmy look up the value of the Hummel figurine he saw at Neff Copy rapiers, which we learn has a value of over $8,700. This was then followed by Jimmy leaving a phone message for Mike where he states to him that he has a job offer. So with all this being said, based on all the context we have about this scene, this plot is seemingly going to result in Jimmy attempting to enlist the services of Mike in order to steal this figurine in the next episode. Following the conclusion of this scene between Jimmy and Kim, the last scene of this episode in Act 4 displayed a scene that was teased to us many times prior to Season 4 of Nacho, Arturo, Victor, and Tyrus at the Los Pollos Hermanos distribution center that culminated with the most intense and surprising scene of the season so far. Following Nacho and Arturo strong-arming Victor and Tyrus for an extra kilo of a currently unknown drug, in a shocking twist, the scene was then taken to another level when Gus Fring and his men ambushed Arturo in dramatic fashion and simultaneously held Nacho captive. Following Nacho looking on helplessly as Arturo suffocated and died, Gus then revealed to Nacho that he knows what he did to Hector, but the Salamancas currently do not, which Gus then followed by stating to Nacho, quote, "From now on, you are mine." So with this intense and dramatic final scene being taken into consideration, following Nacho thinking that he might have been able to salvage the situation with the cartel, any plans he may have had are now completely worthless, as it appears that he will seemingly be forced into being Gus Fring's man on the inside to report on the inner workings of the Salamancas. And I think Nacho is in fact aware that once Gus no longer has any use for him, Gus will want to make sure that his time in the cartel ends in the same fashion as Arturo. So with all of these plot details from the second episode of Season 4 being stated, I thought this was without a doubt another amazing episode that displayed a multitude of intense and compelling storylines that also left us with an enormous number of open-ended questions heading into the next episode, including, will Jimmy's felonious activities be taken to another level? When will we begin to see the inevitable decline of Jimmy and Kim's relationship? What is next for the plot of Howard Hamlin? Where will the plot of Mike working for Gus take him? Where will the plot of Gus and the cartel go from here? What will be the fallout of Arturo's death? And finally, what will happen with Nacho, whose world is clearly collapsing around him? All of which I cannot wait to see unfold in the next episode of Season 4. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any new videos about the 4th season of Better Call Saul. As always, my name is Anton Jackson. Thanks again for watching.